Thank you, everybody. Happy Friday. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm not using a microphone, so if you can't hear me, just start waving dramatically. That should do it. So I'm very happy to be here. All of you, I'm assuming, are interested in transportation, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. But I'm going to be talking about it in terms of climate change and how transportation is a critical part of the climate change puzzle, and specifically how we're doing pretty bad at it, at least here in California, which is why I titled this Driving the Wrong Way. It's just too easy to come up with puns when you're dealing with transportation, so I couldn't resist. And I'm going to talk about two aspects of it, which in the advocacy world sometimes kind of come to blows. So on one hand, I'm going to be talking about our land use policies in California and how they are contributing to increased driving miles. But I also want to talk about policies to deal with the vehicle traffic that we are going to be left over with, even if we had ideally great smart growth type policies. We know we need to transition the vehicles that are going to be remaining to zero emission sources. So I'm going to talk about some of the efforts to do that transition and what some of the headwinds from the Trump administration in particular have been on that front. So a lot to talk about there. And I say that these two advocates of the zero emission vehicle side and the smart growth side sometimes come into conflict. And it's not that critical to this talk, but it's just kind of an interesting dynamic that you do hear from some opponents to smart growth. Hey, why do we need smart growth? All the cars are going to be electric, so why bother with this? And of course, you have people on the transit side that some of them really hate cars, for understandable reasons in certain cases. And so the idea that a zero-emission vehicle now takes away one of the big negatives of an automobile, which is the tailpipe, it undercuts their ability to criticize private vehicles. So interesting tension. But for me, I'm kind of like Switzerland. I like smart growth. I like zero-emission vehicles. We need them both. So that's what this talk is mostly going to be about. So before I launch into that, actually, this is like this problem statement right here visually. Although I have to admit, I took the slide from a picture of traffic in China, so it's not actually California, but we can all recognize it. I could have found one from Southern California. So that's kind of my visual problem statement. So quick note before I launch any farther, just so you know where I'm situated here on campus. I'm at the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley Law School, right across the way here. Do have that appointment at UCLA Law School, but we are a standalone research center within the law school. We have programs on climate and energy, which I direct, also on water, oceans, and land use, and we love collaborating. We love being the law and policy universal donor type of research partner. So if any of you have projects here on campus or otherwise and have ideas for us, we're always open to hearing what we could be working on. And I focus a lot on climate mitigation, particularly on the transportation side. All right, so let's talk about transportation and our climate goals. And I'm going to mostly talk here about California. So hopefully many of you are aware that in California we have a mandate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this year, 2020. And when I first started working on it, it felt like so far off, but here we are in 2020. We have to reduce emissions back to 1990 levels. So the good news is we've actually already accomplished this goal. So in maybe student terms, we already turned in that paper and gotten a grade before it was even due. So in 2016, we actually met the 1990 emissions level. So that's a very good thing. Now, it's going to get more aggressive from here on out. We've got, there's the 2020 goal, and then we've got to get 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030, looking towards 80% reductions below 1990 levels by 2050. Governor Brown, before he left office, also set a carbon neutrality goal, statewide carbon neutrality goal by 2045, which means that any emissions that we haven't reduced at that point, we've got to figure out some way to offset or sequester. So it's very ambitious from here on out. And I should also say that achieving that goal 4 years early, I don't want to minimize it, but there was a fair amount of low-hanging fruit. First of all, we had a pretty bad recession, which dropped emissions to some extent 10 years ago, so that helped a little bit. But also, more importantly, on the electricity side, we were able to take advantage of really massive price reductions in the cost of solar panels. And now we're seeing that on batteries, which I'll talk a little bit about later, that have made it pretty relatively painless to decarbonize our electricity sector. And so that's where most of the gains have come from. But going forward, you can see here from this pie chart, this is basically a carbon footprint of California, how many of these emissions now are coming from transportation? 41% of emissions in California come from, the climate carbon emissions come from essentially driving. And so let's look at a different kind of breakdown on that same chart. So this is the transportation wedge right here. And you can see that most of that transportation wedge is passenger vehicles. And if you factor in oil and gas extraction and production from refineries here, it's actually almost about 10%. So if you add that to the 41%, it's essentially half of the state's carbon footprint comes from driving. So that's a monumental challenge that we're going to have to address if we have any hope of getting that 2030 goal accomplished. And you can see, this is why I titled it Driving the Wrong Way. This is a chart showing our vehicle miles traveled, VMT. And we've been trending since the last recession completely in the wrong direction. This is from state law SB 375, which passed in 2008, which was essentially a bunch of carrots to try to get people to drive less done at the regional scale. And we were supposed to be down to minus 10% VMT by 2020 this year, and then a little bit kind of between 15 and 20% reductions by 2035. You can see this chart doesn't keep going out to this year, but the trends have just gotten worse and worse. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. I mean, generally, a good economy, you see more driving. There is the Uber and Lyft phenomenon as part of it. Demographic change could be part of it. Cheap gas prices could be part of it. But we could see possibly impacts from immigration crackdowns too in places like Los Angeles County, for example. But a lot of it is related to our housing policies and our land use policies. And this gets me back to that cover slide. So the more you build housing like this, the more you dump people onto freeways like this, or whatever the Chinese word for freeway is, since I took that picture from China. Which I probably should have told you, but now you know. And this is back to that argument of, okay, who cares? We can always just electrify all the vehicles. This is a chart, it's not super clear, so I apologize for that, but it basically shows that even if we were to get to, let's say, 50% zero-emission vehicle sales 15 years from now, 50% of all sales, all car sales, and 100% of all car sales zero-emission vehicle by 2050, and if our grid significantly cleaned up, we had a 50% renewable portfolio standard, and I should say actually that the law requires it to be more aggressive than that, and then a 75% renewable portfolio standard by 2050, we still need reductions in vehicle miles traveled. It's not enough to get to even 100% zero-emission vehicle sales. And according to this analysis from the Air Resources Board, we would need a 15% per capita reduction in driving miles by the out year, by 2050. And we're going, as you saw in that chart, we're going in the opposite direction. And this is a very hard ship to turn. So I should say one other thing, which is that even if we didn't, even let's say this chart wasn't totally accurate, let's say we could get down to essentially zero emissions, or other climate benefits from reducing vehicle miles traveled. So if people are driving less, if they're living in more compact homes, near transit, near the job centers, they're more likely to use less energy to heat their homes, less water. So of course there are public health benefits. I was telling folks at lunch today, if climate change didn't exist, if all the climate deniers were right, I would still care about reducing vehicle miles traveled. This has a lot to do with our quality of life, how much time we're spending on in our cars. This also has to do with economic impacts for families, households that are spending a lot of their money on transportation. So even if you forgot the climate piece of it, which you can't, it's still critical to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So hopefully that I made that case. You all seem pretty persuaded. Great. All right, so if we want to reduce vehicle miles traveled, where should we grow? And this slide is about to tell you where we should grow. So we want to have neighborhoods that are more like this. Can anyone guess where this neighborhood is? Just curious. Not Portland.
I see a bread source west.
Anyone from Southern California? All right, it's Pasadena, and this is the Mission stop on the Metro Gold Line. Highly recommend if you want to do some transit tourism in Los Angeles. It's a fun little neighborhood to check out. But bottom line is you want to see density like this, transit-oriented, walkable, bikeable. I mean, I'm not saying this is the greatest neighborhood for that, but it's just a visual example of where we want to go. So we did a report partnering with the Turner Center here at UC Berkeley to do an analysis of where in the state would we want to concentrate development to try to meet some of these long-term greenhouse gas targets and vehicle miles traveled reductions? So we came up with some scenarios looking at future growth out to 2030. And we were basing it on projections that we need 1.5 million new housing units to keep up with population by 2030. That was from the Department of Finance estimates, maybe too low. Governor campaigned on 3.5 million units, but whatever. We know we need millions of units. We went with 1.5 million. Where should we grow in the state, and what types of housing units do we need to see some reductions with that new residential housing? And what we found was that, what we posited was that if we focused on growth within 3 miles of a rail stop and a major transit stop, or focus that growth, if not near transit, in low vehicle miles traveled areas. And we made more of that growth multifamily or attached type housing product. I mean, some single family, but mostly attached type units. This is what the map would look like, first and foremost. So this purple areas were where, ideally, we would concentrate all new residential growth in the state. I should say this was very much a preliminary analysis. We did not do a sort of equity, displacement, affordability piece, so we're not here to say we need to bulldoze low-income neighborhoods. That wasn't the idea, but just to give you a broad brush environmental starting point. We also did not do a financial feasibility analysis to find out if growth was financially feasible in all these areas. We were just looking at sort of raw environmental impacts of this type of scenario. Let's look at what that might look like closer to home here. So here you can see the train stops and the buffer, the 3-mile zones around them. So that's what that would look like. And if we grew in those areas going forward, we would see a 2 million metric ton of greenhouse gas reduction in the state going forward, just from this new residential growth. It would be the equivalent of taking about 400,000 cars off the road annually. And that's just from the residential growth. So that's not to capture the environmental benefits of any new commercial development that might follow in these areas, and also the benefits for existing residences in these areas if they can walk to more things. So it's very much a sort of minimum vehicle miles traveled and emissions benefits.
You say reduction compared to what?
Compared to the baseline scenario. So we also compared this to current growth and the current housing product types. Yes, thank you for asking. So compared to our sort of baseline analysis of where we're going without having an outcome like this. And the greenhouse gas benefits become pretty apparent when you look at this map from colleagues at Cool Climate here at UC Berkeley, which shows average annual household carbon footprint by zip code. The greener the better, and you can see that in all these previously purple areas. I'll toggle back. There's the purple. You can see a lot of the purple is in these green, low carbon areas where people per capita don't emit as much as out in these outlying red areas. Because in these outlying areas, they tend to have bigger homes, they need more air conditioning, more heat, and they drive more. So it's all about trying to reduce those emissions. For those, and not many obviously here from Southern California, as I just learned, but I'll give you the LA version of this. You can actually see it's a substantial amount of Los Angeles. And again, if we go to that green, you see how much lower the carbon footprint is of folks living in the urban part of LA compared to the outskirts. And there's another advantage too. I'm sure all of you who were here last fall remember the blackouts, and we'll probably get some more of those this fall coming up because of wildfire threats, utilities shutting off the power. And you can see that the purple areas also correspond to areas that did not lose their power, were not at risk of high, really severe wildfires. So this is a map from the state just showing here in the Bay Area. You know, you want to live in these areas, you're not going to, hopefully, we won't see a firestorm. Hopefully climate change doesn't get that bad. But these are the higher risk areas. And again, the purple corresponds to a more resilient, climate resilient kind of growth pattern. And statewide, just to show you the fire maps, and they're compared to the purple. So I think I've made my case, right? We should all be building there. We'll save money, we'll save pollution, and we won't have the power shut off, and we won't have our houses burned down. So I think everyone's hopefully with me on that. But of course, this is not happening. We're not building in this direction as much as we need to. And the reason for that is because of our land use policies in the state. Now, ideally, we would do something to try to discourage development out in far-flung areas where people have to commute longer distances and they're facing more of these severe fire hazards. This is just a headline, not to pick on Governor Newsom, but I think this underscores some of the political realities that we're not going to be putting the brakes on housing developments out in formerly farmland area, open space, etc. But meanwhile, we're also not doing enough to make sure we're building in those purple areas. This is a survey from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, from local planners that kind of rank what they see as the challenges to building and infill. If any of you have talked to infill builders, it sounds like a nightmare to try to get any of these projects built. I mean, land supply is an issue, parcel configuration, land ownership, public opposition. You've got infrastructure issues, lack of zoned land, high fees, lawsuits, the list goes on and on. And generally speaking, from a developer perspective, it's much easier to try to build out in the hinterlands where you're much less likely to get sued or have neighbors come to the planning commission meetings, city council hearings and complain because they don't want to have anything built near them than trying to go into these urban infill areas, these purple areas. The expression is cows don't sue. So it's better to go to these far-flung areas. So that's kind of the dynamic that we face in California. And it's what's really making it all so difficult at the local level is that our governance system very much provides the decision-making authority at a hyper-local level to city councils who are often captured or heavily influenced by homeowners associations or particularly irate neighbors. So the elected official incentive is to defer to neighbors that are opposed because their elected officials are representing these sort of hyper-local districts. Whereas if you had decision-making done at a more regional scale, more regional level, you would have outcomes that would make more sense for the region as a whole. So in terms of the policy changes that we would need to encourage more infill housing, more of that residential development in the purple areas I was talking about. Number one, we need to relax local zoning. Local zoning is really the DNA of development at the local level. And what happens is you have communities that don't want to see development, and so they will deliberately zone land with height restrictions, with density restrictions, high parking requirements, setbacks. They'll have multiple discretionary review processes, multiple hearings, so multiple opportunities to try to sink these projects. And I referenced SB 50 there. Is everyone here familiar with SB 50? All right. I see a few heads nodding and a few not. So SB 50 was an attempt by State Senator Scott Wiener across the bay in San Francisco to basically require local governments that have major transit stops in their jurisdictions to have essentially a minimum floor, a minimum standards. So they couldn't oppose height restrictions below a certain amount, 85 feet and then 55 feet would have been the minimum. They're not allowed to impose density requirements. It's all within about a quarter mile and then another half-mile radius of major transit. Basically telling local governments, you need to upzone around transit stops. We need to allow apartment buildings near our major transit stops. That will address the housing needs, that will address declining transit ridership, and it'll put people where we need them to live if we're going to have a sustainable climate going forward. So the idea is that if you don't build that apartment building in a place like this in Berkeley with good transit access and good jobs, it's not like the people who would have moved into that apartment building are suddenly going to evaporate. They're just going to find a place to live somewhere else. That may be out in the hinterlands if that's the best we can do to provide them with housing. So what SB 50 would have done would have relaxed those local zoning requirements. Unfortunately, from my perspective, SB 50 went down to defeat on a full Senate floor vote last month after being held up last year and the predecessor bill being killed the year before. So this is a tough sell because state government officials, many of them served as local government officials. They're sensitive to those concerns. They don't want to override local control. And so it's a real tough political battle. But we need to do something to require upzoning around our transit stops. We can't keep these restrictions on apartment buildings around our major transit stops like BART, just as an example. The other piece of it, so the zoning is one, but then you have the permitting processes. And that's where projects can get held up. Even if you're consistent with the zoning, and the zoning is pretty generous, you have to go through multiple hearings oftentimes at the local level. And if the permitting is what's called discretionary, meaning it's not just sort of a yes or no, does this project conform to our rules? If there's some discretion by decision makers, that can trigger lawsuits because that's where the California Environmental Quality Act comes into play. And the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, requires environmental review of all discretionary decisions. So you could get rid of a lot of the lawsuits just by making these decisions ministerial, meaning that it's just up or down. Does the project comply with our rules? If it does, It can go forward. If it doesn't, we'll reject it, but there's no need to have an environmental review process because that already should have happened at the rule-making stage. And then, of course, the other thing is we need to increase our transportation investments in infill areas versus spending more money to expand highway capacity out into those far-flung, non-purple or bright red areas that I showed you on the maps earlier. But that's just on the infill side. We also need to do something to discourage all the auto-oriented housing, that housing I showed you in the first picture. We don't want to see more of that, and we don't want that to be the only affordable alternative for people who are looking to buy a home. So this is politically tricky, but one option, we've seen it work in some places, there's some debate about it, but urban growth boundaries. Portland is probably the most famous example of that, where they were pretty diligent about putting an urban growth boundary on. Again, there's pros and cons, but that is one way to do it. Basically say development can't happen outside of this boundary. Because we're dealing with a world of climate change, with wildfires, insurance is actually going to become a huge part of this. If people know that they can't get insurance if they buy in a high fire risk zone, or if the state is not going to be subsidizing insurance for those folks, that's going to potentially decrease people's appetite to go live in some of these high fire risk zones that also happen to be high vehicle miles traveled zones. And related to that, we could have higher standards for buildings built out into these high fire zone areas. So they'd have to have hardened construction, meaning not flammable, and there would have to be stricter maintenance standards for those property owners, that they have to maintain their properties in a certain way in terms of vegetation management and other features to try to decrease the fire risk for those homes. So this is something we should be doing anyways. There's reasons to do this anyways, but I bring this up because these are policies that could potentially discourage growth out in these areas. And then the other piece of it is that we could be imposing fees on these projects. These projects create externalities for everyone else. That means more traffic, more pollution, and also when there are bad fires, we have to deal with a lot of the firefighting costs and the other damages that come out of the development that's there. So there could be wildfire fees. There also could be something that I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, vehicle miles traveled fees on these projects. And then I just threw out this altering the liability piece. Since I come from a law school, I have to always bring up liability. But right now, you may have read that when the utilities cause a fire, where they contribute to a fire, as we've seen in California way too many times in the last few years, they are 100% liable for all the damages from that wildfire. That's just kind of a weird, could be sort of a semi-constitutional quirk. It's a hard doctrine to undo, but that's the reality here in California. The problem with that, and while I, just like everyone else in this room probably, I'm not a big giant fan of PG&E and their practices over the last few years in terms of dealing with this fire risk, it's not all their fault. They're not the ones who allowed a lot of this development to go into areas that we know are fire prone. And so they also are not responsible for how property owners have maintained their property, right? Or how the Forest Service, when we're talking about mountain areas, how they've maintained the forests in this state. So if we actually apportion liability based on fault, it would look very different. And potentially local governments, other landowners could have some liability if they're not taking appropriate measures to deal with the fire risk. So that would be another way to address some of the challenges about the outward growth. Now this VMT fee thing, this is kind of a hot topic now for wonky people in the transportation world. And we wrote a report on one of the major laws that has made this a hot topic. And I also mention it because we worked with ITS to get funding to do this work. So I want to thank ITS and SB1, all the voters, for voting for the gas tax increase, because that gave us some research dollars to do this report. But the law SB 743 passed in 2013. Took a long time to go into effect because of the controversy over this. But basically, it required that under the environmental analysis for new projects, the transportation piece of it could no longer be about auto delay in the immediate area of the project. That's how it used to be done. If you had a project, you wanted to put it into a city, if it created a big traffic jam on that street right there or at that intersection, that was considered a significant impact and mitigation had to follow. So you can imagine that for urban infill projects, it's going to hurt them disproportionately. If you're putting a project in San Francisco, a couple extra cars could jam up an intersection. The worst case sort of poster child for this is the Van Ness bus rapid transit route, which if you guys have been through San Francisco recently, you've probably seen it under construction. this project was deemed to have an impact on 3 intersections on Van Ness, slowing traffic down on those intersections. This is a bus rapid transit line, right? So when we're talking about impact, we're talking about slowing down single occupant type passenger vehicles. Because of that, it was found to have significant impact and therefore had to do a full environmental impact report, phone book sized, took 10 years. It seemed like a very counterproductive result when we're talking about putting transit in a crowded urban area. Meanwhile, projects out in the hinterlands aren't going to have any impacts on transportation under that metric because they're going to have some giant arterial that they're probably adding out to this project, and then they're going onto the freeways. And so they're not actually technically slowing traffic down at all, even though we know they're dumping a huge amount of cars into the region's roads, creating traffic, creating air pollution problems. So what SB 743 said is we're going to not look at that auto delay metric. We're going to look at overall vehicle miles traveled that these projects are generating. And so this is a big change. What that means in practice is that if you have a project that's going to increase vehicle miles traveled, you have to do things to reduce the number of miles your project will generate. And you can do things on site. You can reduce the parking available, make it harder for people to own cars. You might hand out transit passes. You might pay for a transit line out to your project if you have a big enough project. You might change the mix of uses in the project. You might add bike lanes, bike share. I mean, there's a whole suite of measures you might do if you have to mitigate it. If you're an infill project, you're presumed not to have an impact. So that's you basically get a get-out-of-jail-free card on that piece of it. But here's the question. What if you don't have that many feasible options to reduce driving miles that your project is going to generate on site? Now, under the law, if you do everything that's feasible, and so that means that an agency might say, well, you tried pretty hard, everything else is probably infeasible, it would be economically a killer for your project, just go ahead and build the project, thanks for these few mitigation measures you put in place. What people have come around to see is that maybe we can give people an option to buy out the rest of the vehicle miles traveled that they can't reduce on site. That's where this concept of this mitigation bank or exchange comes up. The idea that a developer reduces as much as they can, but they can go to a bank, pay money, and get credits for VMT reduction that happened off-site. And the money that they paid is used to create or to fund mitigation measures elsewhere. Maybe their money goes to pay for a bike lane that might reduce vehicle miles traveled, or a new transit line, or transit passes for low-income people. It could be a range of different things. But the basic idea is that you put a fee on a project that's going to increase. That's my arrow up right there. I'm pretty excited to find that on the keyboard. That increases VMT projects that increase VMT, and a bank or exchange can fund off-site VMT down. See the arrow going down? Sorry, I'm not very technically proficient, so I get really excited when I figure things like this out. And the scale could be at the city level, it could be at the county level, regionally, or it could be statewide. You could have a statewide mitigation bank that California sets up. So high-speed rail, for example, if they're going to create impacts, I mean, hopefully they don't increase vehicle miles traveled. Probably it's more like highways that would. They could pay into a statewide mitigation bank, and that money could then be used to pay for reductions. And I use the word exchange because the exchange could operate differently from a bank. A bank is more like, we've got a price, just give us some money, we'll figure it out. An exchange would be more like, hey, there's a menu of projects here that have been deemed to reduce vehicle miles traveled by a certain amount. I'm just going to pay for that project. So that would be an exchange. That's why we have the lingo there. And a lot of jurisdictions are interested in setting these up. San Jose, Contra Costa County, San Diego. So this may become a major feature of how we try to mitigate vehicle miles traveled going forward. The types of projects, they could be small versus some larger transit expansion type projects. There's going to be question marks around, are the mitigation measures going to be ongoing, or is it just a discrete one-time investment? The other critical piece of this, we got to make sure, similar to carbon offsets, that we can actually verify that these reductions are happening off-site and ensure that they would not have happened without that investment. That's where you get the word additionality. The carbon offset market gets into this all the time because let's say you're taking an airplane flight and you feel guilty about it and you buy some carbon offsets. Maybe those dollars go to save some forest somewhere from getting cut down. But how do you know that that forest was actually going to get cut down anyways? You don't, right? I mean, hopefully someone's checking it out. But that's where the additionality piece comes into play, that these reductions would not have happened without that investment. But if we do set these banks and exchanges up, we're also going to have to be worried about geographical and social equity. if you have a project going into an upper income area, or sorry, a project going into a lower income area where all the impacts are going to be felt locally, but then the offset type dollars are all spent in higher income areas, that's going to be a problem. So just something to think about if any of you come across these VMT banks or exchanges. But I think it's a pretty interesting area that California is really going to be pioneering. The upside is that it's potentially a way to generate a lot of revenue for projects that a lot of smart growth people want to see happen, bike lanes and transit, et cetera. So I want to conclude on this section of sort of what to do on the land use side, but I just want to talk a little bit about what the stakes are here, because this is bigger actually than just California. So I have a slide here that shows the average Californians' greenhouse gas emissions per capita. You can see we're 10.8 per capita metric tons versus the average American, 20.3. So we can feel pretty good about this in California, something to brag about. We're half the carbon footprint on average of other residents. But the more we don't build housing in California, particularly in infill areas, what's happening is that people are leaving the state. I mean, I could probably ask for a show of hands how many of you know people who have essentially been priced out of this place. Now, a lot of people are being displaced to some of these outlying communities. I mean, we've seen major sort of resegregation in the Bay Area. Not that we were ever fully desegregated, but you're seeing a lot of people of color from places like Oakland moving out to communities like Antioch and Stockton with long commutes. Same dynamic in Southern California. But a lot of people also are just getting out of the state completely. They're moving to Phoenix. They're moving to Las Vegas. They're moving to Houston. They're moving to Dallas or Austin. These are places with higher carbon footprints, particularly if they're leaving their tiny apartment in California and buying a single-family home for $200,000 in the exurbs of Houston. They're driving a lot now. This is a problem. Now, politically, if you're a Democrat, you may like it because they're turning a lot of these states blue. But from an environmental perspective, although actually, if they vote for climate legislation, maybe it'll all equal out in the long run. But I think we can all say that for the short term, it's not good if people are essentially being kicked out of the state into high polluting areas. So that's part of the stakes. It's not just about a better quality of life, a cleaner quality of life, and meeting our climate objectives here in California. It's about really the nation as a whole and the world as a whole. So I'm going to just stop there on the smart growth piece of the talk and transition now to the other piece about electrifying transportation and moving towards zero-emission vehicles. And I'll take questions at the end, but if there's anything I'm saying that's unclear, just interrupt me. People in my family do it all the time, so I'm used to it. So we talk about zero-emission vehicles. Technically, there's a few different technologies at play here. So you've got hydrogen. You may have heard of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. They are not selling very well. They're very expensive. The fueling infrastructure isn't there. I think the consensus at this point is that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are not really going to be a major factor for passenger vehicles. I think they will be a factor for freight, long-haul trucking in particular. And there will be different roles for it, but I'm not very big on hydrogen generally. There also is potentially biofuels, depending on the feedstocks that they come from. We're using a lot of kitchen grease, for example, ironically, maybe not ironically, but just kind of a strange thing, but that's where we're meeting a lot of our biofuel goals from brown grease. But also, if you take it from feedstocks where, things like landfills or places where things would decompose and create a worse climate impact, if you're actually converting those to biofuels, even though they're burned there by not decaying into methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, you might actually get a net negative greenhouse gas impact from biofuels, but we're not really going in that direction. The big thing is battery electric vehicles. Show of hands, how many of you have ridden in an electric vehicle? All right, pretty good. That's good. When I started giving this talk on this subject maybe 5 years ago, and almost no one raised their hand. So, of course, we're in Berkeley, so maybe it's not that representative. But many of you, I'm sure, have been following Tesla just as an example, or read about Tesla. This is the Model 3, pretty transformative vehicle in terms of electric vehicle sales. The interesting thing about Tesla is that they really went at the electric vehicle thing in a completely different direction than the other automakers. The other automakers thought that they could sort of create these little Priuses and go with the eco-friendly market. Tesla just said, forget that. We're not going to market the environmental benefits. We're going to market this as a cool car, access to technology. And it turns out that the car buying market is much bigger for the segment that wants cool cars that have great technology versus the segment that just cares about the environmental footprint of cars. I care about the environmental footprint of cars, maybe others in here as well, but we don't represent that big a segment of the car buying public. That's just the reality. So Tesla just said, we're not going to even market these as an environmental, environmental good. Sorry?
They do batteries and solar power too.
Yeah, they do batteries and solar power. I mean, they consider themselves an energy storage type company. But in a lot of ways, I think this is an important lesson for those who care about the climate, which is that people actually care about the climate. Unfortunately, it's not as big as we'd like. So we got to figure out how you get those sort of crossover hits. Not just by putting that blues song for the audience that likes to buy blues music. You want the mainstream to buy it. So that's kind of what we need to see more of, and I think Tesla's been successful at that. Now, for people who hate cars, it's not just about zero-emission passenger vehicles. This battery technology is in use all over the place. So battery electric buses, shuttles. The city of Los Angeles just announced they're putting an order for like 150 battery electric buses. E-bikes are all the rage. I haven't ridden one, but I heard they're great. And then these scooters, which I vow not to ride on because I am certain that I might as well just go straight to the emergency room because I'm going to crash en route, so I might as well just get there a little faster. But hopefully, maybe some of you are brave enough to ride some of these things, but I'll pass. So this battery technology is a really critical strategy for all sorts of mobility needs. And as we move more people, hopefully into infill areas, it's not just about transit access, it's about these other types of mobility too. And California has been the absolute leader in the US on zero-emission vehicle deployment. There's a chart showing sales of zero-emission vehicles. You see the green line is California. We are half of the United States electric vehicle sales in California. And you can see the trajectory is pretty good. We had kind of a down year last year, which I'll explain in a minute. But the reason why we're doing so well is because of our policies. We have very aggressive state policies on zero-emission vehicles. So number one, we have a mandate for zero-emission vehicles. Automakers, if they're selling in the state, a certain percentage of their vehicles have to be zero-emission. If they don't have any models that fit that description, they have to go buy credits from manufacturers that have an excess. We have cash rebate that's tied to your income level that you get if you buy an electric vehicle. And we also have carpool lane stickers. So we're doing a lot. The federal government, meanwhile, had a $7,500 tax credit if you bought an electric vehicle. But that was set to phase down by manufacturer after a manufacturer sold 200,000 vehicles. Unfortunately, that hit Tesla and General Motors. So I think that's why we've seen a decrease in these sales. In the last budget, the Congress actually wanted to extend out those tax credits, which have been a really powerful force for encouraging adoption. But supposedly President Trump himself is so opposed to electric vehicles that he said he would veto the budget bill if that was included. And so that's the end of that. Meanwhile, his Environmental Protection Agency and Highway Agency are trying to roll back fuel economy standards. That's in litigation. Won't be resolved until after this presidential election. So if a new president, we get a new president in January of next year, a lot of the stuff I think will go away. If we don't, we've got some real problems with the federal headwinds. The other piece of it is that the federal government is trying to revoke California's ability to set that zero-emission vehicle mandate. Now, in the past, it was sort of automatic that the federal government would allow California to exceed federal standards. And that was a quirk of the 1960s passage of the Clean Air Act, well, basically the predecessor to the Clean Air Act, recognizing California's special space on that. That's being sued. They're trying to test it in ways we haven't seen before, but our sovereignty to have cleaner cars is definitely under direct attack in California. There's another piece of it, though, beyond just the vehicles themselves, and that is the charging infrastructure. This is a map from plugshare.com showing all the fast charger, sort of the fastest rate of charging stations in this part of California. Pretty good deployment. Tesla has invested in their own private infrastructure network that other vehicles can't access. But in the meanwhile, California is trying to do a lot to encourage deployment of these charging stations. Because people, one of the reasons they say they don't want to buy an electric vehicle is they're worried they have no place to charge it. And so we need more, particularly these fast chargers put in so people can feel comfortable taking road trips. If you live in an apartment building without a parking spot where you can plug in and charge, then you may need to rely on fast chargers in your neighborhood to charge. So California directed settlement money from 2 legal settlements towards infrastructure investments. So the rolling blackouts that we had 20 years ago in the state, some of you are probably too young to remember that, but one of the settlement pieces with the company, the subsidiary company that was found at fault, had to invest $100 million in EV charging. That's where the company EVgo came out of. And then more recently, Volkswagen had this Dieselgate scandal where they were put these defeat devices in there to avoid pollution rules. They had to spend $1 billion essentially on electric vehicle charging infrastructure in California. That's where the company Electrify America comes out of. And then meanwhile, we've authorized utilities like PG&E to spend about $1 billion in infrastructure to support these charging stations. So we're trying to do a lot, but we're still lagging. There's a lot of headwinds there in terms of local permitting, in terms of electricity rates, which I could get into. But just so you know, that's kind of where we are in terms of charging infrastructure. So I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I will wrap up here. I will just briefly talk about some general next steps here. And this photo is my way to sort of visually describe it. Maybe a nice parallel to the first photos showing bad land use leading to bad transportation patterns. Basically, when you think about smart growth, it's Sacramento. I hope all of you recognize this. This is the state capital. Okay. I should have done a quiz on that. So this is the state capital. This is where we're going to solve the smart growth challenge in California. It's not going to be done under the status quo local governments. We need legislation passed by state lawmakers that fundamentally change our governance structure, change those permitting processes, address fees, address the tax structure, all these things that combine, that keep growth from happening where we need it and encourage growth in areas where we don't need it. So that's where you should be looking. And then, it's not really Congress's fault at this point, but kind of is. We need federal action on the zero-emission vehicle side of things. They're doing a fair amount to support research, R&D on battery technologies and faster chargers. But I talked about the tax credit essentially expiring for American car companies like General Motors and Tesla. But that kind of fiscal support and then backing off of states like California that are trying to do more to encourage zero-emission vehicle deployment. We need them to back off and let federalism happen. So if you want to know what to do on an individual basis, I would say if you have to drive, get a zero-emission vehicle. If you can afford it, there's some pretty good used models out there. Of course, you want to bike or take transit. And if you want to know how to vote, think about these issues at the state level and at the federal level as well. So thank you very much. With that, I'm happy to take questions. You guys have been a great audience. Appreciate it. Question?
Yeah, Prop 13 has had a huge effect. You get a lot of fiscal zoning by cities where they zone for commercial and retail, but they don't, they push the housing further out. Last time I checked, for example, Santa Clara County had 3 jobs for every 2 employed residents, so they employed a lot of workers. And unless we change that, I think we're still going to be stuck.
Yeah, so Prop 13, I think, is a major factor. I mean, I would say the zoning and the permitting are still the top 2. From what I've seen, the research that I've seen. I mean, there are a lot of different factors. If this was easy to solve, we wouldn't be in this mess. It's taken us decades to get here. Prop 13 is definitely a factor. It gives local governments the incentive to zone land for commercial over residential. They can get more money from sales tax than they can from property tax. And also, people like us, when we live in a community, we need more services, fire departments, ambulance, police, et cetera. So we're fiscal losers for our cities, generally speaking. And also landowners have little incentive to redevelop. If you have a commercial property, why would you redevelop that? If you live in your home, you've got a bunch of extra bedrooms, you have no incentive to move out or put in an accessory dwelling unit. So it really skews the incentives badly. We do need reform. There's going to be most likely a measure on the ballot in November of this year that would split off commercial properties from residential properties. The Chamber of Commerce is going to fight it tooth and nail. It's going to be a massive campaign. But basically it would say commercial properties, you no longer are going to be grandfathered in at a low commercial property tax rate. And they actually exploit that and make it even worse because anytime a corporation changes hands, rather than selling the property, selling the company, it's basically a corporate buyout. So that it's a new owner of the property, but they get to keep the same tax rate. It doesn't get reassessed because there's no change in ownership technically of the property itself. So they get around it that way. So Disneyland and other Disney company, they pay hardly anything in property taxes. So the only reason I mention that deals with the commercial side. If that passes, and that's a big if, that splits off. If commercial property interests from the residential side, you could then go back to the voters to undo all of Prop 13 on the residential side, because now you're dealing with a state that's majority renters, and the business community is no longer going to have a strong stake in the residential property tax breaks that are under Prop 13. So there may be a path forward to kind of undo that. And you can also do things like get rid of the Prop 13 for vacation homes, second homes, things like that. Other questions?
Okay, one thing that hasn't been mentioned is campaign contributions. Locally, it's real estate industry, and that's a horrible headwind. And at the national level, you have control over that.
Yeah, so in terms of the political dynamics, campaign contributions, it's interesting. Like with electric vehicles, you've got the oil industry. Actually, a study came out showing it was actually the railroad industry that was mostly behind kind of keeping fossil fuels, because that's mostly what they ship. They make so much money shipping oil, coal, other things. So I didn't really expect that, but it is a fossil fuel industry as well. But with zero-emission vehicles, you've got utilities now on the other side. And California actually did this explicitly by authorizing utilities to invest in electric vehicle infrastructure. It essentially pits big utilities against big oil in California. So that's one way to sort of change up the political dynamics. In terms of the smart growth policies, the real estate lobby, I mean, they definitely fund a lot of elected officials in California. Labor unions are a huge source of campaign contributions in California. They both supported SB 50 and it still went down. So I think the homeowner lobby is ultimately at this point more powerful than labor and real estate combined, at least judging by the vote on SB 50. So it's a mixed bag.
I wanted to talk about, you had mentioned about prioritizing transportation investments, like especially in infill locations. So what do you think like the political path would look like for that? And I think you can kind of imagine maybe a similar like SB 50 dynamic in terms of elected officials where urban people elected would be more supportive of that and suburban electeds would be very hesitant.
So yeah, so this would be under the VMT, banks or exchanges, if private developers went ahead and paid for some improvement, right? That's what you're referring to on the private
Sure,
investment?
and you just mentioned generally like prioritizing transportation investments towards infill, but I think if
Prioritizing. I thought I said privatizing.
Oh, prioritize.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think more voters at this point tend to be in these urban areas, so there's some logic to prioritizing those. I mean, it is a difficult political question. I think the way that the state has approached it is not so much that hey, we're going to be expanding highway projects in rural areas, but we'll make sure your roads will be in good shape. You're not going to have potholes. We'll keep it in a state of good repair. But that we really don't have a reason anymore in the state to expand roadway capacity. And actually, San Diego County, of all places, which is one of the more conservative urban parts of the state, they have said basically no new lanes that are not managed lanes. So if they're going to put a new highway lane in, it's going to be a toll lane, or it's going to be a high occupancy lane. And that's San Diego. So I think there's a strong argument to tell people, look, we've spent a lot of money on roadway, and we tell people it's going to solve traffic, but it just induces more congestion. So the logic isn't there anymore, and we need to spend our resources more wisely. So I think that's kind of the way politically that they're dealing with it.
When you were saying earlier with the VMT scenarios that you're comparing it to a baseline that's also based on California, so and you see how bad the problem looks, but how bad does it look when you compare it to other first world places like Boston or Marseille? Something where VMT per capita is so much better than it is in any scenario in California, that I feel like we don't have a realistic sense of just how horrible things are in California, because if we're just comparing it to other California possibilities, then it makes it look like, oh yeah, we could do a little bit better, but we have to do an awful lot better in order to have the standard of living that people have in the rest of the first world.
If you look at the national VMT chart, and I'm just showing the California one, I mean, it's tracking California's. And our highest growth areas are in cities that are repeating the development patterns of California, in essentially the Los Angeles style of development. So the fastest growing areas are all high VMT places now. And places like the Northeast that are much more walkable, transit friendly, and have much lower VMT per capita, or go back to Europe or parts of Asia, they're much better about this. I mean, that's actually not the norm, unfortunately, across the country. But yeah, I saw this firsthand just a few months ago. I was fortunate enough to go back to Madrid for the UN climate conference there, and I flew through Dallas. So I landed in Dallas around rush hour, and I just couldn't believe it. Was just out to the horizon sprawl, and of course all the 10-lane highways were jammed. And then meanwhile, when I'm landing in Madrid, you see these very compact towns with trains between them, almost no one on the freeway at the morning rush hour, and they have much lower VMT per capita. And this is true, throughout these kind of these older cities. So we act like this is an unsolvable problem, and but absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of models of how to do this correctly, but it just takes the political will to do it. I think some of the objection that you hear is, well, we shouldn't force people into living in a rabbit hutch in the city, and don't take my car away from me. And I don't even think we have to get aggressive about that. It's really there's demand. People want to live in a more convenient neighborhood, but we don't build that supply for people. There's a reason that you see gentrification in some of these San Francisco and Oakland neighborhoods, because they're very convenient and walkable, and higher income people want to live there. So if we don't build it elsewhere, they're going to continue to gentrify in these disadvantaged low-income areas where we don't want them displacing people.
With issues regarding high-speed rail and kind of failure of it to be able to further expand, what efforts are needed in California to ensure that larger projects to connect different cities can continue to move on track without falling behind like we've seen with high-speed rail? To ensure that, especially like low-mileage battery electric vehicles, like ones that only can do 80 miles, people can actually have opportunities to take an alternate form of transit.
Yeah, so we're talking about the inner city type connections. And high-speed rail is a sad story. I mean, we spent about $20 billion. We built maybe 115 miles in the cheapest, flattest part of the state. So it doesn't bode very well for trying to get it to the urban areas. But it still is under construction. It's going forward. There'll be some kind of usable segment. But it does show that, even for urban rail transit projects, we are terrible at building this stuff. Not just here in California, but across the country. It takes forever. It's really expensive. We just don't do a good job at it. So we need to look at some low-cost options. I mean, there is freight right of way, and there's some interest in having a better regional rail network, but that takes money and some political will to put that in place. If we could, have more shuttle buses and give them priority access, that would be a way to do it. But it takes money and political will, unfortunately. But I think chasing big, shiny rail infrastructure projects, I personally am a fan of them, and they can work well if done right. It takes too long. It's too expensive in California. So let's see what we can do in the meantime.
Well, we need to learn from the Europeans and the Chinese.
They've got a lot of high-speed rail. So maybe I got time for one more question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there is actually a lot of highway expansion going on in the Bay Area and in San Diego. It's called hot lanes. And most, if not all, these hot lanes aren't even recovering their O&M costs, let alone the capital costs. You end up having the public subsidizing the users of the hot lane. And that, to me, is just wrong from all kinds of perspectives. Environmental justice, greenhouse gas, you name it.
Yeah. I mean, ideally, those revenue, if there is enough of it, can be plowed back into transit solutions or offset some of the equity impacts. That would be the thinking. See, one more question. We're going to take one more.
You mentioned the possible negative effect of Uber and Lyft. In addition, it's clear now, I believe, that there are negative effects on transit use and there are increases in congestion. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't know the data, how definitive it is, but it seems clear that what we've seen, it's definitely creating congestion. So I think the only way really to deal with this is some kind of congestion pricing, which we probably need anyways. Now, the Uber and Lyft companies, they seem to be in favor of that because they're happy to kind of have people buy in if that clears out the roadway of all the sort of discretionary drivers. But I think we need to be moving towards congestion pricing regardless because our roadways are at capacity. And there's ways to do it that are more equitable because that's sort of the big objection that what do you do about low-income people? I mean, really low-income people are, they can't afford a car. So it's kind of a different income segment where it can make or break. And I think we have to do it in a sensitive way. But ultimately, we have to start pricing our roads, I think, because, there's no other way to address traffic. And if we can use the revenue in a smart way, it can have multiplier benefits. So that would be my hope for addressing Uber and Lyft. And there are other things you could probably do, forcing them to carpool, have multiple pickups, things like that. So I think I'm out of time, but I'm happy to stick around for a bit if anyone else wants to chat. Thank you all.